Hey guys, Martine here. Before we start today's show, I want to tell you about an upcoming event I'll be doing here in DC. It's a live podcast taping at the Apple Carnegie Library, focused on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'll be talking with Ryan Williams from the DC Public Library, both about Dr. King himself, but also about the role of libraries in this moment when what you read can be seen as a political act, and the role of technology in activism and social change. It's going to be a great conversation. This event will be taking place at 2 p.m. on Saturday, January 25th. So if you're in DC and you want to join us, you should sign up in advance. We'll put a link in today's show notes and at postreports.com. All right, here's today's show.
Welcome to the Wow, I'm off to a great start. We're not calling it the campaign moment anymore.
I was just going to say.
It's long over.
I thought that was actually what you were doing. It's like, just kidding.
Just kidding.
Formerly known as.
Yeah, that's the cold open now. Welcome to Post Reports from the Washington Post and our Friday Politics Roundtable. It's Friday, January 24th, and I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter here at the Post. I'm joined today by senior White House reporter Isaac Arnsdorf. Hey, Isaac.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we're also joined by Marianne Levine, who you might know as a 2024 campaign reporter, but who is moving over to cover the Department of Homeland Security and the border. Hey, Marianne.
Hey, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
So the 2024 campaign and transition periods are both over, but we're going to keep bringing you these Friday conversations so you can keep up on all the big news that's happening in our politics right now. And given it's the first week of President Donald Trump's second term, a very busy first week in which Trump set the tone for the next 4 years in some sometimes controversial ways, there are tons of big things that we're going to talk about right now. One is the Trump administration's strategy behind a barrage of executive orders that Trump signed this week. The second is an immigration crackdown that Trump ordered that's already underway. And finally, Trump's pardons and commutations for January 6 defendants, including those found guilty of seditious conspiracy and assaulting police. So I first wanted to start with executive actions that have been rolling out this week because it's just been a fire hose. There's been dozens so far on everything from climate to energy policy to even renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Isaac, you actually previewed this strategy back in December. Let's leave aside immigration for now. We're going to get to that later. What are the big ones that have happened this week, and what is the Trump administration 2.0 trying to do by flooding the zone like this?
Well, flood the zone is exactly it. You also have to remember Trump made what sounded like a comical list of all the day one things that he promised to do. So he showed up and he actually made a point of doing them all. You know, he showed up to the rally at the Capital One Arena after the inauguration speech with a huge stack of materials for him to sign, and then he tossed out the pens like souvenirs.
Sir, can I have a pen?
Could you imagine Biden doing this? I don't think so.
I don't think so.
He's trying to project that they mean business, that they really are fulfilling all these day one promises that he made. Now, a lot of these orders that he signed are really campaign press releases on White House letterhead. They are directing agencies to come up with plans to do things. They are not themselves doing things. And that's a reflection of both, the fact that they actually need to get their people in place, get their operation up and running before they can do some of the more ambitious policies. And it's also a reflection of what you can do unilaterally on executive authority versus what you need legislation for.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to note here. People might hear about all these things that Trump is doing. These are executive actions. They can't change the law. They can basically work underneath the laws that have already been passed. You can still do some very significant things, but because of those limitations, you are going to see legal challenges. We're already seeing some legal challenges to some of these things. Can you walk through some of the biggest items and the ones that could be challenged legally and might not actually wind up making a big difference?
The administration's attitude is basically, sue me. They are not just expecting the legal challenges, but they are in some instances intentionally provoking the legal challenges because that will lead to outcomes they're trying to achieve, they think. So again, so leaving immigration until later, a lot of these first actions have to do with government operations. So that is removing diversity training programs for federal employees. That's removing diversity considerations from federal grants and contracts, changing how civil servants are categorized to basically make it easier to fire them. And
replace them with loyalists potentially, which is something they've talked about quite a bit.
Well, it's a campaign promise itself. It's part of the idea that he ran on reining in a government bureaucracy, but it's also operationally, in order to carry out the things he wants to do with mass deportations. And, those are the kinds of huge logistical undertakings that they need to have their team in place to execute.
Marianne, Isaac talked about how some of these are kind of press releases in the form of an executive action, and that's been true of executive actions for a long time. But I think Donald Trump is somebody who understands the theater of politics a lot better than most people who have even inhabited the White House to some extent. What message do these executive actions send to Americans and more specifically to his base? Like, how do you evaluate the political strategy of doing these things, even if some of them might not hold up?
I think it's a way for him to tell his base that he's following through on his promises. And I think a lot of what we heard on the campaign trail actually did happen in terms of his promises. Now, as Isaac points out, whether or not they actually get executed is a different story. But Trump on the campaign trail promised to eliminate birthright citizenship for the children born in the United States of undocumented immigrants. He talked about restarting Remain in Mexico. He talked about mass deportation. And a lot of these executive orders are, at least on the immigration front, are intended to set the stage for those policies. Now, separate question whether or not he'll be successful at it, but he did really preview a lot of it. And I think the thing about Trump is you can always often summarize his policy ideas in a single sentence or in a single title. And I think the executive order titles and the way they're written really mimics the way he talked about a lot of these policies on the campaign trail.
And since Marianne brought up kind of consumer-ready titles for executive orders, I have to point out my favorite is putting people over fish.
Putting people over fish.
which is not typical legalese.
Who can disagree with that?
Well, this actually is a serious thing that has to do with the fires in California.
Yeah, he's basically said the water is being diverted to save the Delta smelt, and so they didn't have enough for the wildfires or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's not as if that there's like a ton of water sitting in Northern California that they can just move to Southern California and deal with the fires.
Yeah. So, Isaac, we've mentioned the legal challenges that could be brought against many of these executive actions. Some are already being brought, actually. These things tend to get filed very quickly. Can you talk about the biggest legal battles ahead and what that will mean for how the early actions of the Trump administration are going to be regarded?
So this actually reminds me a lot of the first term where there was this deluge of executive actions. The week kind of culminated in the chaos at the airports because of the ban on travel from Muslim-majority countries that then got enjoined by a judge. And that kind of slammed the brakes on this shock and awe opening. And, kind of similarly, it was this week, it was a flood of executive orders. And then we got a temporary restraining order from a federal judge putting the brakes on the birthright citizenship executive order, which the challenge is that violates the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Similarly, on day one, just as soon as Trump was inaugurated, there was a lawsuit filed against, I'm not going to use the name, but the thing that Elon Musk is doing, which is maybe cutting government spending, maybe changing government technology. You all know what I'm talking about. But the way that that's structured as, being led by someone who's not a government official, not subject to government disclosure or government ethics rules, there's a challenge to that. That you can't have somebody exercising government authority who isn't in the government.
Right. Maybe Isaac won't say it, but I will, just so the listeners can know. It's called the Department of Government Efficiency. He calls it DOGE. DOGE. This is the organization that, of course, Vivek Ramaswamy was supposed to co-lead. He's left that now. Marianne, Isaac talked, and you talked about birthright citizenship. That's one of the executive orders that Trump has attempted. It seems to be one of the diciest ones, given this is something with Supreme Court precedent that has suggested that these people are supposed to be citizens. Can you talk about some of the other more significant executive orders, specifically on immigration?
Yeah, so among the other policies that Trump rolled out on Monday was declaring a national emergency at the southern border. This is a similar tactic to what he did in his first term, where he essentially declared a national emergency to get funding from the Department of Defense to continue to build his border wall. It seems like we're going to continue to see the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense really play a role in militarizing the border. We reported earlier this week, and my colleagues Nick Miroff and Maria Sacchetti reported that basically Trump is planning to already send 10,000 troops down to the border. So we're seeing in the executive...
This is a significant difference between the national emergency declaration from the first Trump administration and this one. This seems to be kind of a prelude to, sending troops to the border, maybe a mass deportation operation. Is that how it's generally being understood?
Yeah, that's how a lot of immigration experts are seeing this, that Trump is essentially setting the stage for the mass deportation plan that he has and potentially using the military in a different way than it's been used previously. So I think that's going to be a really interesting question to look at. Among the other policies that Trump introduced on Monday through the executive orders was putting a pause on the refugee resettlement program, essentially ending asylum, and also stopping the CBP-1 app, which is basically an app that the Biden administration introduced for migrants to make appointments with the U.S. government for legal entries. So we're seeing not only a crackdown on illegal immigration, but also ways that people are trying to enter the country legally.
That's a good segue into something that I think we're going to be seeing, and we're already seeing a little bit, which is the real-world consequences of these actions. Can you talk about some of the ways in which we're seeing these changes, manifested in the real world?
Yeah, I think that our colleague Arlise did a great piece on day one where she spoke to people at the border, and I think there was a lot of shock about just people's appointments just disappearing and not really having any warning of when the app was going to shut off. And so I think it's a little early to say what the impact of these policies are going to be, but it seems like the goal here is deterrence for the Trump administration. And I think what will be interesting to see will be whether or not the border crossings really do decline significantly in the coming weeks. I think it's important to note, too, that illegal border crossings have just been down a lot this year because of changes that the Biden administration made. But I think what the goal is for the Trump administration is to enact these hardline policies to really discourage people from coming.
Yeah, and also I'm hearing about Democratic states and localities maybe not necessarily going along with this or giving, people to assist in these operations. This creates some difficult choices for Democrats who, in recent years, recent months especially, kind of moved to the right on immigration, especially, embracing a more of an enforcement-first mentality. But what are some of the difficult choices that Democrats are going to have to make and local office holders are going to have to make about these immigration issues that are coming from the Trump administration? I
think there's going to be a tough balance with figuring out the balance between where the party was a couple years ago in terms of their approach to immigration and how much to cooperate with the Trump administration and how much to protect undocumented immigrants who are in these bluer cities. And so I think we don't quite know yet, but I think we're going to see a different approach perhaps than we did in the first Trump administration.
Yeah. Marianne, we're talking about the executive orders now, but I wanted to move over to Congress too, because they've actually been doing things on immigration. They started off by passing a law, the Laken-Riley Act. This is a law that is named for a nursing student who was killed in Georgia last year by an undocumented immigrant from Venezuela. They first tried to pass this, and Democrats weren't really on board with it. The Biden administration wasn't on board. But then we saw Democrats, a significant number of them, certainly enough to get this over the line, move in favor of this. Can you just talk about what this law is and that evolution from Democrats?
Yeah, so basically what this law would do is it would require ICE to detain undocumented immigrants for theft-related crimes. And so basically the House Republicans tried to pass this bill last year. It did not. The Senate basically did not take it up. And
it did pass in the House with some Democratic support. And just so we're clear, the bill would make it so undocumented immigrants could be detained for an accusation of theft without even being convicted.
Exactly. It passed in the House with some Democratic support, but the Senate never put it on the floor. The Senate at the time was democratically controlled. What we've seen in the vote this time around of the bill passed this week was that we saw a greater number of House Democrats support the legislation. And then we saw 12 Senate Democrats support the bill's passage. And I think what was interesting was I think the party really did not have a succinct message on this bill from talking to Senate Democrats. And I think what we saw here was just the impact that Trump's election had and the impact it had on the party moving more to the right on immigration. Now, it still does not have a cohesive message on the issue, but I think what's really telling is who the senators are who voted for this bill. Mm-hmm. And I think I did the math. 9 of the 12 who supported it are from states that Trump won in the last election. And so I think it sort of speaks to the dynamic in their state and the fact that, you know, there's a sense that the party needs to move more to the right on immigration to show that they support secure borders. But I think that it's a tricky balance because the party moved more leftward when Trump was president the first time around.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing, Isaac, that they've decided as a party, it's that they no longer want to be viewed as the party that is soft on immigration enforcement. They're not talking as much these days about paths to citizenship and things like that. Can you just talk about how, you know, from your vantage point, how much the Democratic Party actually has shifted on this? Or is this just a momentary reaction to the election results? What's this kind of staying power of this shift in how the two parties act on these issues?
I don't think it's limited to immigration. I don't know that the Democrats have a cohesive message on anything right now. I mean, it's a leaderless party. It's an out-of-power party. And, you know, what has been the Democratic response to the January 6th pardons, which I know we're going to talk about? What has been the Democratic response to a lot of the controversial cabinet nominees? You know, I've talked to both Republicans and Democrats who just feel like they can't articulate what case the Democrats are making. It's like it doesn't exist.
I think that's a great place to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk more about Trump's mass pardons of January 6th defendants. We'll be right back. So we mentioned Trump's January 6th pardons, and I think it's worth just emphasizing the scale of these pardons. Donald Trump gave clemency to everyone who had been convicted in the January 6th cases. He pushed for the dismissal of all January 6th cases that remain. 14 members of the right-wing Oath Keepers and Proud Boys extremist groups got commutations, while the rest of the convicts got blanket pardons, more than 1,500 people. This goes somewhat beyond what I think a lot of people expected and what Vice President J.D. Vance suggested we'd see earlier this month. We saw Vance go on the Sunday shows and say Trump obviously would not be pardoning people who assaulted police. Trump, in fact, did that for everyone who assaulted police. Isaac, can you talk about how significant this is?
Trump never ruled anything out.
True.
The campaign's official position was it'll be case by case. Trump never said that anyone was off limits. And he ultimately decided that he didn't want to get into the business of parsing who was deserving and who wasn't. So that's how you got blanket amnesty. And what I think is underappreciated here, and we just did a story about this that went up Friday morning, yes, he is trying to rewrite the story of what actually happened on January 6th.
Which he's been doing for years.
Right. And this is a culmination of that. Yes, he is throwing a bone to his base. Yes, he is justifying his own behavior on January 6th. And yes, he is doing something that has taken a lot of the media oxygen away from covering the withdrawal from the World Health Organization or the Paris Climate Accords. That's all a factor here. But what also happened here is that Trump has really developed relationships with these defendants and their families over the years. They've met him repeatedly, and they've told me about how it made them feel when he would speak to them and tell them that they would be okay and send them souvenirs and speak to their children. And it became a movement and a real personal connection. And that also means that it's not over now. There are some pardon recipients who feel like that has righted the wrong and they're ready to move on. But there are others who are coming out of this saying, we need to be compensated. The same way that the Justice Department would settle with, for example, demonstrators who were cleared from Lafayette Park on June 1st, 2020, outside the White House. We remember from the
racial justice demonstrators,
right, in 2020, and that resulted in a settlement with the government. They want a settlement for what they allege were violations of their civil rights. We saw them on tours of the Capitol, in the Capitol. The leader of the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes, went to the Capitol seeking a full pardon. Trump said he's open to that. He's open to bringing them to the White House.
He's one of the people whose sentence was commuted, not a full pardon.
Right. And so now that this is a political movement, this is not the end of the story. It's not going away.
I think it's safe to say this is something that a few years ago would have seemed somewhat unthinkable. The idea that you're commuting the sentences of people who committed seditious conspiracy, a very historic thing that is about basically, trying to overthrow the American government. We talked about how Democrats don't seem to have a message on this, but it's been kind of a muted reaction from Republicans too. There was a time when Republicans were asked about this as a hypothetical, and they were basically kind of like, well, I can see maybe some January 6 pardons, but we wouldn't do this for people who assaulted police. Like that was kind of beyond the pale for a lot of Republican senators. But this week we saw a lot of Republican senators very uneasy about this. We saw a few be critical of it. Mitch McConnell, Bill Cassidy, and some of the usual suspects like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who are among the more moderate members. But then we saw other members like Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, Tommy Tuberville from Alabama, basically come out and say, yeah, I agree with these pardons. We saw other members basically not want to comment on it. And we even saw, I want to play a clip from Trump's interview with Sean Hannity, where Hannity seemed to be kind of questioning why people who assaulted police were included in this.
You did run on a platform. You were very straightforward. You said you would pardon these people that were sentenced for January 6th.
Yeah, totally.
You did. The only criticism or pushback I've seen is about people that were convicted or were involved in incidents where they were violent with police. Why did they get a pardon?
A number of reasons. Number one, they were in there for 3.5 years, a long time.
Right.
And in many solitary confinement, treated like nobody's ever been treated so badly. They were treated like the worst criminals in history. And you know what they were there for? They were protesting the vote because they knew the election was rigged and they were protesting the vote. And that you should be allowed to protest a vote. You should be allowed to. When the day comes,
you shouldn't be able to invade the Capitol.
No, ready? Most of the people were absolutely innocent.
Isaac, what do you make of these Republicans kind of seemingly giving Trump a pass on this right now?
It's a familiar pattern from when he was president the first time.
I think it also highlights kind of the divides within kind of the old guard Republican Party that's still in the Senate, that Mitch McConnell represents, that Susan Collins represents, that Lisa Murkowski represents, and the more Trumpier faction of the party that's only growing and is only going to be the people in the future, at least for the next few years, likely, who are going to be newer members, I should say, of Congress. So I don't know. I think that split sort of shows some of the divide between the old Republican Party and the Trumpier version that's bringing in newer people.
One of the things I like to do with these kinds of things is I look at the polls. I want to see what the American people think. And what I found is that January 6 pardons more broadly have been pretty unpopular for a while. Generally Americans oppose them by 20 to 30 points. We don't have a lot of great polling on pardoning people who assaulted police, but there was a survey by an interest group that showed that was even more unpopular. About 3/4 of Americans opposed that idea. I think we always ask this question with Trump, which is like, well, is this actually going to hurt him? Like this thing that seemingly people weren't asking for and don't like? I wondered if this has any political staying power or if this is something that we're just going to move on from real quickly.
I think it's hard to say, but I also think that the role of January 6th, I think, has faded in the minds of a lot of Americans. I think in D.C., and I think people here remember the attack on the U.S. Capitol, but I think for a lot of Americans, the election was certified in the end, and I think that the memory of the violence of what happened that day has faded. And so I think it's hard to kind of see like what the impact of all this is going to be, because it's not something that's directly going to impact people's lives.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I mean, I know a lot of Republicans think that Democrats are walking into a trap when they talk about it, and happy to have them focusing on that instead of other things.
What do you mean by a trap?
That a lot of Republicans think that was a mistake for the Biden campaign and the Harris campaign at the end for emphasizing January 6th too much. On the other hand, the polling shows what it shows. There's pretty good evidence that January 6th was a factor in the midterms. And
in 2022.
Right. And midterm electorates are different from general electorates. Trump and Republicans and the January 6th pardon recipients themselves keeping this in the news going into the 2026 midterms could be a different story.
One of the things that I've seen both Democrats and Republicans talk about with regards to these pardons is not what Trump did, but also what President Joe Biden did on his way out the door, which is he not only pardoned Hunter Biden, his son, last month, but then he pardoned more members of his family. He pardoned a bunch of figures that were involved in the House January 6th committee. Trump has previewed a desire to prosecute these people for reasons that in some cases aren't terribly clear, but there's this big fear about retribution. And so these were preemptive pardons, basically not outlining a specific crime, but saying that these people can be blameless for a period of time during which Trump has suggested certain things could be prosecuted. Can you guys talk about how significant those pardons are and how they compare to what we just saw from Trump?
I think it's hard to say, but the pardons for Biden were obviously familial pardons. And so I think that can take on a different tone that can lead to criticism of nepotism, and that we've heard from some Democrats and also Republicans. And then I think that with Trump, it's pardoning individuals many of whom were violent and
actually convicted of crimes.
And so I think it's two different criticisms there, but I think it sort of shows like the politicization of pardoning and how it's a relatively new phenomenon, I think, that we're seeing. And I think it also, on the Democratic side, shows the concerns that Trump is going to follow through on the threats of retribution. But yeah, I think it shows broadly just that pardons have become pretty politicized and used in ways that they have not been used before in both parties.
Yeah, I mean, the juxtaposition on Monday, starting with the preemptive pardon of the lawmakers who investigated January 6th and ending with the pardons of the people who committed the violence on January 6th is a pretty stark symbol of the transfer of power that occurred.
It certainly is, and it's certainly a sign of the political times. But we're going to have to leave it there for now. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me today, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron.
Marianne Levine is a national political reporter for The Post covering the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration. And Isaac Arnsdorf is a senior White House reporter. Make sure to keep an eye out for Isaac's new book. It'll be about the 2024 election. It'll tell the inside story of it, and it will be out this summer. If you're tuning in via the Campaign Moment show feed, we will keep bringing you these conversations for a few more Fridays. But make sure you follow the Post Reports feed so you never miss these episodes and all the other stories the Post Reports team brings you every weekday. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Sam Bair. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Rachel Van Dongen. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Ted Muldoon, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Svirnovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresden, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, Martine Powers, and Elahe Izadi. I'm Aaron Blake. Have a great weekend.
I do feel like you have a very good podcast voice.
Oh, do I really? I hate my voice. I hate the way it sounds.
I feel like it sounds good.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
I know, Isaac has a low-key podcast. Isaac's really good
I
on
love
podcasts.
but it's like a Snoop Dogg kind of thing, you know? It's like he's very
That's a
low-key,
first.
but it's like...
That's a
I
first.
was
You've not
about to say, I
gotten
don't
the
know
Snoop Dogg thing?
No.
I don't know if anyone's ever compared Isaac to Snoop Dogg, but I like it.